From last week, James he was really laying into the rich. He said in chapter 5, James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, to weep and howl because of the miseries that were coming upon them. And the miseries, we understand, is the judgment of God. From verse 4 of James 5, it says, the outcry of those who had been oppressed by the rich, the outcries had reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. The Lord of Sabaoth, the commander of armies, the Lord of hosts, commander of 10,000 upon 10,000 of angels, armed for battle, ready to do the will of the Lord. And the commander is poised to rain down his wrath and his destructive force with this angelic host on the wickedness of these oppressors, these rich, as James calls them. And it's not just because that they have lots of money that automatically they're wicked and evil. That's not the case. What James is saying, he uses this phrase, the rich, to talk about the people of influence, the people with control over others, and usually that is the wealthy. But James is against the rich who do evil with their riches and their power. Those who oppress others and whose aim, whose goal is to take advantage of whoever they can for their own benefit. In verse 4, James explains that there are people who have worked, they have labored and harvested the fields for these rich individuals. You can just picture the harvest is over, the grain has been sold, and the money's being counted by these rich, these wealthy, and they're fanning through the bills, or maybe they had coins back then. I like to picture they're in their office, up high in one of those tall towers, and maybe they look out in the hallway and they see all the people who have labored for them, all the people that they need to pay the money to. And so the rich, wealthy, they get up, they go over and they shut the door. And then they take all of those coins, all their money, over to their safe. They open up that door and they put all the money in there for themselves to keep. What are the poor going to do? They are powerless to resist. The poor have few resources. They're low down here. The rich, they're up here. This is the idea of James chapter 5, verse 6. This is a judgment against the rich. James says, you condemn and put to death the righteous who do not resist you. It's the idea of stomping on an ant. What can that ant do to prevent your boot from squishing it, right? You take from the lowly worker because he cannot stop you. And they think that they're getting away with it. But James says, someday you will weep and you will howl. Why? Because of the Lord and all of his hosts are coming against the evil and the oppression of the wicked people. And sometimes we do get to see God's hand in somebody's life, that justice happen. We discussed last week, like the leaders of the Jews in Jerusalem. They experienced a judgment when Rome sieged the city. But how often do we see people who live their whole lives with relative comfort, seemingly never to face the wrath of God? When will they get theirs? When will God's judgment come against these oppressors? When will God put them in place? These are the kind of common questions we hear when we're talking about, or when we notice that it seems like injustice is allowed to thrive. James is reassuring us in chapter 5 that the outcry has been heard by the Lord of Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts, and God will repay. James 5, 7 through 9, it says, therefore, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it, until it gets the early and the late rains. You too, be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Do not complain, brethren, against one another, so that you yourselves may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing right at the door. Therefore, in verse 7, tells us that everything James is discussing in 7 through 9 is going to be related to what we just discussed previously when we were talking about these rich. He says, be patient, therefore. Well, why? Oh yeah, because the cries have reached the ears of the mighty Lord of hosts. So I need to be patient and wait on God's timing and wait on God's hand of justice to repay the wickedness that's even been done to me. But, James, did God say how long he was going to be taking? I don't want to be rude or anything, but it's just that, well, they took my money last week, and I have bread to pay. Or I'm paying all these taxes today. Or in our culture now, we're told that we can't teach what the Bible says anymore. These things are happening now, James. So when is God going to do something about it? I know we're not the only ones that do this. The other day, well, it was last year now, but the girls, Deborah and I, were at the park, and we picked up some acorns, and the girls decided that we should plant them at our house. So we got home, we dug a small hole, we put the seed in, and we covered it in dirt. And you know what happened right away? Nothing. Nothing that we could see. Something started happening immediately under the surface, didn't it? Even though we couldn't see it. James 5:7 says, be patient. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it until it gets the early and the late rains. You too, be patient. But wouldn't it be cool if as soon as we covered that seed with dirt, up pops a little stem and it turns into this big trunk, and then that trunk branches out into a big giant canopy? But is that how it happens? A farmer, as he's planting rows, as he's planting the field, does he turn around and look behind him and expect to see the crops growing? He knows to wait on the rain. He knows to wait on the growth he knows to wait that something is happening below the surface. But when will the crops be ready? Farmers have a good understanding, certainly better than I do, of when crops will be ready. And there's so many factors to think about. How much rain, what type of soil, what field they've been planted in, when it was planted. And they have a good idea, but even the farmer, when they're planting, they don't know exactly how long it will be before the crops are ready. So they wait. Patiently, most of them. And they check, they watch for things like the level of moisture or the dryness of the plants. If you garden, you wait patiently for certain smells of certain fruit or vegetables. You wait for certain colors or for the fruit to pull off the vine easily. James 5:7, therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it, until it gets the early and the late rains. You too be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. This is like a child asking his mother or her mother, how long will I have this cough? What does the mother say? You'll get better soon, sweetheart. It won't be long now. She's encouraging the child. strengthening their heart. James is doing the same thing. He wrote his letter in about 46 AD. He said, "The coming of the Lord is near." Well, James, that was almost 2,000 years ago. Are you sure you meant to use the word near? Have you all heard that time is relative? This is a picture of a mayfly. And if I'm not mistaken, we had one of those in our house just yesterday. Did you know that a mayfly only lives for a single day? Think for a second how long it would take for a bug this size just to fly around your house. Maybe they're looking for a way in. Just one time around your house. How long do you think that would take? Maybe a minute? It's not a lot of time, right? Because we view time from our perspective of our lifetime. Compared to 100 years, 1 minute is nothing. But what about for that fly? Compare that 1 minute to the 24 hours that this bug will be alive, and suddenly that same amount of time becomes much more significant, doesn't it? 2 Peter tells us that from God's perspective, 1,000 years of our time is like a single day for Him. You think about that. How old is the earth? Most creationists suggest probably about 6,000 to 7,000 years old, basing that off of the genealogies in the Bible and the evidence in the ground that they see. So, in God's perspective, if 1,000 years is like a day, how old is the earth from God's perspective? Like a week old? To God, that's no time at all. Stretch a week out in eternity. Stretch 6,000 or 7,000 years out for eternity. That's even a dot on God's timeline of eternity. We told our girls that Grandma and Grandpa would be traveling all week. They'd be home in a week. And they said, "No! That's forever. We'll never see them again." To our girls, to 5-year-olds, a week is forever. Time is relative. For us as Christians, James said, "Be patient, for the Lord is coming soon." And you know, we're looking at our watch and we're checking our calendar, and it's been 2,000 years. And for us, that is an incredibly long time. But from God's perspective, 1,000 years is a day. Church, He just made this promise a couple days ago from His perspective. But you think about it. James's promise that the Lord's coming is near, it was true for the Christians in the first century. And that was 2,000 years ago. We are certainly closer to the time now when Jesus will return. So that promise is only truer and truer with every day that passes. James 5, verse 8, he says, "Be patient. Strengthen your hearts. Be encouraged. For the coming of the Lord is near. Do not complain, brethren, against one another, so that you yourselves may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing right at the door." And to our context this morning, that almost seems out of place. You know, we're talking about being patient and waiting for the Lord to repay our oppressors. And now James says, don't complain, brethren, against each other. What does that mean? It means you be careful about how you are treating the people around you. Why? James 5, verse 9, because the judge is standing at the door. If somebody has wronged you, don't take matters into your own hands to try to get even with them, or you might end up just as guilty as they are before the judge. Do not complain against one another, so that you yourselves may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. We really like the idea of payback, don't we? Maybe it's ingrained in our minds as children. We have to get even. We love getting even. But think about what happens when we take matters into our own hands. Think of just a simple, innocent example. Think of two children in the classroom, right? If Bill hits Tom, and Tom only does what Bill did to him, and Tom hits Bill back, who gets in trouble? They both do. They both get sent to the principal's office. I see road rage happen where somebody accidentally bumps into somebody's car, and then once they get hit, the other car, they just go for it. They just turn and completely swerve into the other car. Well, now they're both in trouble. The message is, don't retaliate, because you might end up under the same judgment, or worse, as the person who initially wronged you. And it gets more serious the more that we think about it. Well, he murdered my brother, so I killed his brother. Well, now you're both guilty of murder. Therefore, James said, be patient. And this is hard to do. Let God judge and deal justly with each according to their deeds. Church, if you think that's unfair, if you think that is asking too much, you need to study the pressure of James's original audience. Who James wrote this to first. These Christians who suffered persecution at the hands of the Jewish officials. They suffered at the hands of the governors or the Roman Empire. The whole Bible class this morning, I was just smiling ear to ear. We're studying Stephen in the Bible class. This is basically the historical context of the book of James. The events that happened in Acts 6 and 7 and 8, James is writing just a few years after these events. Men and women being drugged from their homes, being tried before rigged courts, being sentenced to death immediately if they're lucky, after being tortured if they're not so lucky. James wrote to them too. His message was the same. Be patient. James, are you serious? Are you seriously telling me to be patient when they've raped my wife, when they've killed my family, when they've taken my house, and now I'm on trial, and I'll be dead in the morning, and you tell me to be patient? Patient for what? This is when I started smiling. What did Stephen see when the men were standing over him, beating his body with rocks? Acts 7, verse 56. And he said, behold, I see the heavens opened up, and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. Well, that's a little confusing because Hebrews 10:12 says that Jesus made his sacrifice and then sat down at the right hand of God. So why in Acts 7 is Jesus standing back up? And Don said because he was honoring Stephen. He was concerned with Stephen. And that's absolutely right. In the Bible, there are other examples of kings standing. You have sometimes an emotional response like anger. They stand and tear their robes, or surprise when the king stands and he sees 4 men in the furnace. But there's another reason kings stand. That's to give their judgment. Consider Isaiah 3, verses 13 through 15. This is Isaiah speaking God's judgment against the people of Judah, God's own people, for their wickedness and their rebellion. Isaiah 3, 13 through 15. Listen to these words. The Lord has taken his place to contend. The more you study that phrase alone, the deeper it gets. Another word for contend is to resist. James just got done telling us in James 5, verse 6, that the righteous do not resist. Why not? because that's God's place. And here comes God taking his place to contend. What do we call a boxer or a fighter in the ring? A contender. Do you see the perspective? Imagine the worst oppressor. Imagine maybe it's the Roman emperor, maybe it's the Jewish high priest sitting over the council who condemned men like Stephen or condemned Jesus. Imagine anyone who has ever done wrong to you, cheated you, took advantage of you. Imagine them in a boxing ring. And then imagine God taking his place, pushing down the ropes, climbing into the ring. Imagine God with all of his glory, all of his might, all of his wrath, stepping into that ring. Isaiah 3:13, the Lord has taken his place to contend. He stands to judge the people. The Lord will enter into judgment with the elders and the princes of his people. That's the rich that we're talking about in James 5, those of authority and power. And God says to them, it is you who have devoured the vineyard. The spoils of the rich is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people? Grinding the face of the poor, declares the Lord God of hosts. That's that military term. The Lord of hosts, the Lord of Sabaoth. God is saying, get ready for your payback. Every day, church, God is active in our lives. It's just often we can't see what's happening. It's like roots growing underground supporting a big oak tree. But someday, very visibly, God is going to take his place to contend in the day of judgment. It might be today. I always like thinking about that. Man, I couldn't even finish the sentence and Jesus could part the clouds and descend. I mean, we don't know. It could be tomorrow. Or it could be another 2,000 years from now, maybe more. The message of James is still the same. Be patient. God is calling us to trust in him with the patience of faith. The more you trust in God, the more patience you can have. Trust that he will stand and he will give his judgment and that he will repay every single deed done against the lowly and the oppressed. And when God repays, what does James promise? They will weep and they will howl when the sentence is levied against them. Ryan brought up this morning in the Bible class, and I think Stephen had an understanding of the judgment of God. I think Stephen knew James 2:13 even before it was written. Judgment will be without mercy against those who have shown no mercy. Stephen knew what these men, as they are beating him to death with rocks, Stephen knew the wrath that they were storing up against themselves in God's wrath against them. That's why Stephen, full of grace, Ryan, you hit it on the head. Stephen, full of grace, prays to God, Lord, do not hold their sin against them. Show them the mercy they do not deserve, like you show to the rest of us, Lord. Do you have mercy and grace like that? Do you have faith enough to wait patiently on God, to be able to leave room for him to contend? Don't become guilty of God's judgment yourself. Stand in faith in God like Stephen, like those that we read in the Bible, who trust fully in God's power and in God's deliverance. This morning, if you need encouragement or you need a shoulder to lean on, or if you need prayers for